pass those back.
And all that, yeah.
It used to drive me nuts, my mom, especially because she like she's so little. I was like, you need to wash everything.
The workshop, the tomato pepper workshop, that'd be like the one you
jacket.
get.
To put on your buttons now.
They get the seed trays.
Yes, I did. She hated it, but I'm like.
I don't even know what I'm doing next week, so.
Well, this is next week, it's only in July.
Okay.
So it's tomato and pepper, plant and seed the seeds. I bet I put.
Let me look and see what she put on.
I bet I took that.
Oh, you got my list? Okay.
Oh,
that's fine.
They get
Seed starting workshop.
Yes, yes. That's
That was very good deal.
okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's the same thing we're going to be doing.
Okay, good deal.
Yeah, we'll be doing.
They get so for the $15 they get a tray.
You get a tray and you can plan up to way more stuff than you need. So and it doesn't. I'll have other stuff too because it's realistically like you don't need that many. But
the state, Jayla at the state has let us let our new interns that will start in August. They get to start if they've paid their fee. They get to start getting their volunteer.
okay, that's cool. Yeah.
So that would be a fabulous thing for them to come to. So I'm going to recommend it for them. And it'll be at 10 and 1.
Yes. That I do know. I just go where the boss tells me to. And so,
That's a good thing.
good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, good morning.
Let them get settled and we'll get started. Oh, sorry for my handouts being printed funny. Somebody changed the settings on the printer and I'm really weird about wasting paper, so I only like to print on front and back. And by the time she printed them and realized, she was like, "Do you think he wants me to reprint them?" I was like, "No, like,
No.
we'll just have to make do."
This is good for your brain. It
Yeah.
makes your brain,
Yeah.
think in a different way.
This is good compost too, huh?
Yeah, yeah. I better turn this off. Been going off today.
Go ahead. Good morning.
We're doing all right, I think.
No problem. No problem.
Oh, right here,
Next one.
right here.
Yes.
Oh, let me get y'all. Did y'all grab handouts?
I did.
Okay, I just want to make sure. If not, I'll get you one. So, all right. How's everybody doing this morning?
All right.
No rain.
Thank goodness. I don't ever want to see any more rain
I don't say that.
until fall time. Like,
No time soon.
oh,
With mosquitoes.
that's
Yeah, they do bring a lot of mosquitoes.
mosquitoes and the challenge of being in the lawn and landscape business is not easy. So I'm tired of mowing grass every weekend, trying to catch up. So this is the first Saturday we haven't mowed grass in a long time. So yeah. All right. So today my goal is to talk about the basics of composting, trying to keep it in a granular, simple level, because composting is one of those topics I feel like even for myself that is intimidating. It's often, people, they don't know where to get started, or they dive too much into it. And there's a lot of complex ways to compost, but I want to keep it kind of simple and look at the basics and understand how compost is actually made, because I think not only in this talk today is there the ability to understand how to create compost at home, but there's a way to understand how soil works and how soil is created in itself. Because everything that turns into soil starts as some form of organic matter, some larger particle of something. And composting and breaking things down is how we get to that level. So, start out today, I found that this was very interesting, that if we composted many of the things that we throw away, such as kitchen scraps, grass clippings, leaves, things that are commonly out there in our everyday life, whether it's from maintaining the yard to cooking in the kitchen that we could divert 20 to 30% of the trash we put out at the road from going into a landfill simply by having compost being a more common practice. And interesting enough, I know like growing up, like I remember like living in Port Neches. Port Neches gave away the green compost wire baskets, and they were like commodities whenever they quit doing them. But I remember growing up in the alleyway, my dad, somebody gave them theirs they didn't want, but we had multiple compost bins, and my parents weren't even gardeners. Like they didn't take on my grandparents' like hobbies and such, but we still composted grass clippings and things, and it was a far more common practice for everyday use than what we see nowadays.
So what if you grass clippings have weeds in it? Now my yard has St. Augustine, but it's probably got weeds in there too. So I don't.
It probably does, but a lot of times, like this, the weeds are going to break down.
So it's okay.
It's okay, but if I would eliminate really weed-ridden areas if I'm bagging or collecting. But at the same time, like it's a whole nother subject for another day. Like I would only bag up portions of those clippings. I wouldn't bag up everything because those grass clippings are, as we talk about what they provide, they're immense resources for going back into the yard. People who bag their grass clippings, it makes no logical sense. They're robbing themselves in the soil from vital nutrients that are part of composting. So composting is essentially it's the natural process of recycling organic matter or materials into nutrient-rich resources or amendments. So we're basically taking things that were grown, and whether it is like large, very old, like trees and organic matter, we could even get down to like thinking of like hard, rocky materials. They eventually are broken down by nature into sediments, and they turn into soil, or they go through essentially the composting phase.
Give me an example of a hard, rocky material.
Yeah, you could have like sandstone. It breaks down as it impacts like water, and it's a larger particle, but over time it breaks down and it becomes soil. So it's very similar. Compost obviously is a little different, but the goal, I guess my point is that everything starts as something larger and is broken down, whether it be soil or compost. Compost, why is it important? Why is it, people view it as like this immense resource, this like really important thing when it comes to gardening? Because it improves soil structure, it improves soil health, it improves moisture retention, and for me, really it improves the soil food web, which is probably one of the most important and underrated things as a gardener, and the average gardener does not look at what's actually happening below the surface because we can't see it with our eyes. We don't really know what's happening down there, but we've got to use practices and resources that are ideally, by principle, working to better that. So compost is beneficial because it reduces waste. I think that as a gardener, we have ethical responsibility to reduce waste. Gardening can be very wasteful. We can buy lots of things that in turn contribute to plastic waste, that contribute to water waste by using the wrong nutrients that actually don't embetter our soil, that actually make our soil worse. So there's all these different ways as a gardener that we can create waste. So I think that composting is a way that not only we can recycle different materials like grass clippings, we can recycle healthy green waste from vegetables back into a compost pile. Like yesterday, we cut out a lot of our tomato plants. All the ones that were still really good looking are going into the compost pile. The ones that were not healthy looking, we separated them out, and they're going to go, unfortunately, to the trash, because it's important to pay attention to what we're putting in, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
Excuse me. whenever you say going into the trash, what would be the benefit of that as opposed to burning it
I mean,
and using the ash? I mean,
you could definitely do that. I mean, burning, it's going to kill off any of the bad things that we don't want, and that's like not putting them in the compost pile. You don't want to put anything that's unhealthy, because if it's disease ridden or has some kind of virus, that can still live in your compost, and then you're spreading that stuff out.
right.
And putting bad bacteria, bad fungi, and things that you don't want back in there. But you could, heat definitely destroys.
Yeah.
That's why I kind of like, you think about boiling water. You're killing bad bacteria in water, so you make it safe for drinking. Same kind of concept, at least in my mind. That's how I would look at it. So compost is going to improve soil structure because we're putting back good microbes, good fungi, bacteria into the soil. We're putting in things that introduce oxygen that help improve soil structure. You dig in the ground here, it's always typically dense. It's always typically compacted, unless you've been doing some things that improve soil structure for a really long period of time. It helps retain moisture. Moisture retention, I think, is really important. While, in times like now, we're getting crazy amounts of moisture, but is that moisture actually getting deep into the soil? Is it reaching the water table, or is it saturating in a really shallow level and then it's running off, which is very, very common with clay type soils? So introducing compost, which is a different soil texture, into the native soil is long-term going to improve that soil structure and improve water retention. It's going to help reduce the need for chemical fertilizers, because ideally compost is a way to cycle nutrients. And in permaculture methods, they're not using fertilizer at all any longer. They've recycled and utilized natural sources such as manures, and they've composted these things down to create essentially their own regenerative fertilization process. So long term, you can reduce your need to have to go to the store and purchase fertilizer if you're creating high quality compost. And that doesn't necessarily have to be manure-based compost. Lastly, it's going to support healthy plant growth. Compost does not take the place of fertilizer in a sense, but it is far more well-rounded. You're going to have minerals and nutrients inside that compost that might not otherwise be found in a fertilizer you buy off the shelf and put out. It's also going to have the microbial inoculation, because compost was created by the use of microbes, so you're actually putting these beneficial organisms back into the soil if they're not present in abundance already. So let's talk about what can be composted. So the most common things that we're going to compost are going to fall into two categories. We need greens, which are going to be essentially your nitrogen sources, and we need browns, which are carbon. We have to have a ratio in order to achieve the composting process. We're usually going to want about 2 to 3 parts carbon to about 1 part nitrogen. So it's very easy to get your compost pile out of balance. So you kind of do have to pay attention to what you're putting in. So examples of greens could be food scraps, food waste, vegetables, fruits. We could, even though it's not necessarily green, coffee grounds, they're nitrogen rich. Things like tea, compostable tea bags. These are things that you use in the kitchen. Fresh grass clippings, healthy plant trimmings of all different types. So essentially anything that is green or living is the best way to look at it. So green doesn't necessarily mean green color. It means that it's actually something that's alive.
So no cooked. You have leftover potatoes, those are not going to go in your compost.
I wouldn't say I would put cooked things in there. I've never done that before, so I don't know if there would be any pros or cons to it.
I didn't know if it would draw creatures in.
Most likely, yes. Carbon-rich materials or browns are going to be dry leaves, straw, hay. You can do shredded newspaper. cardboard, paper towels, small twigs. Whenever we're putting them into a compost pile, we don't want to put in like really, really big pieces of like debris, because they're going to take far longer to break down, and then we're not going to achieve what we want out of the compost pile because it's taking forever. So there are ways around that. So if you are, if you commonly on your property get larger pieces of brown matter or like dead debris, you can break it down, break it into smaller pieces. Even your dry leaves, you can take it and you can mulch them with a mulcher or like a mulching mower. Break them down into smaller particles and they're going to compost faster. The bigger they are, the longer the process takes. That's why a lot of times people always, I remember when I first tried to learn about composting, people at first, told me you don't want to put like a bunch of hardwood leaves in there. I was like, well, it doesn't really make sense because they are browns, they're carbons, but it's because the size. When you have really, really large amounts of it, it's going to take so much longer to break down. So getting it down into smaller pieces is immensely beneficial and will speed up the process. So we can compost with manures. Animal manures are an excellent source of nitrogen. They're also a source of beneficial microorganisms. And when they're used correctly and they're decomposed correctly, they do really create a nitrogen-rich compost. But they're probably one of the ones that people make the most mistakes with, depending on the source. You can compost with chicken manure, rabbit manure, cow manure, even goat or horse. Cow manure, obviously. When you're dealing with grazing animals, if you are getting a manure source from grazing animals, it is good to be mindful about whether they're grazing on pesticide treated pasture, because those pesticide residuals they reach inside the animal, they're in the excrements, and then they make it into your compost pile and eventually into your garden. The remnants of pesticide use are long lasting, and as home gardeners, we don't really have a whole lot of, we don't really have a way to know what's in that. So chicken manure, if I'm a home composter, rabbit manure, or even like goat manure, if you're a goat raiser, would be great, because 9 times out of 10 for small like backyard flock and livestock raisers, we know what we're putting into our yards, we know what we're putting into the feed, and we have a much greater control over what's going into the manure, which is going into the compost pile.
Which
Now,
of those can you use immediately?
rabbit manure is a cold manure, so you can use it as is. It doesn't have to be composted. You could put it into a compost pile, sure, but you could
Put it directly.
you could shovel it right out of the bottom of the cage or the pen and put it right into the garden and get immediate benefit. And that's why it's one of the most popular, and it's abundant. Like rabbits, they make a bunch of manure real fast. So when you're going to the store and you're buying, like if you come to me and you ask for compost, you'll find that manure-based compost are the last thing that I recommend. Because number one, I don't know what's in it. I don't know where these cows or where these chickens have been raised, most likely not in great conditions. And secondly, also, a lot of times they're actually poor quality, because nowadays these compost makers are putting in a lot of fillers or mulch type material, larger particles, and they're doing that so it'll absorb the smell, so that whenever somebody over here wants to go and buy it and put it in their front landscape, it doesn't smell like manure. Or so they're catering to the general masses and trying to sell waste, which is great, but there are better sources of compost out there than what you can buy. So if you want to make your own manure or compost, absolutely awesome. Chicken manure is extremely high in nitrogen, and it definitely takes the longest to break down, and is the one I typically recommend to be the most careful with. You want to make sure that that pile is very, very fine. It is definitely cooled down, and you want to make sure that you're turning it over and over again and going through the composting process that we'll get into a little bit as we go. Fresh manure, you put it out. If it's too hot, it is going to look like you burn your plants similar to like fertilizer burn. It's going to burn the roots. The plants are going to shoot out this real dark green flush of growth because all this nutrient is available, and it's basically just going to burn out because the root system is no longer going to be able to keep up with the resources it now has. You can typically put 1 part manure to 2 to 3 part dry leaves, so very similar ratio. You know, your manure is your greens because it's a nitrogen source, and then you have, you know, your straw, your leaves, or any other browns. But I would ideally say these are going to take longer to break down to usable compost than others. So things that we want to avoid. Now, some of these items, they could be composted and used in proper settings. But as home composters, we don't want to use any kind of meat, fish, or bone type product because these things are going to be an easy way for us to introduce harmful bacteria into our compost piles. They would take proper preparation to be able to go into a compost pile and be broken down. Now, we all know that these things can be broken down and composted, that they can be used for garden sources like bone meal, fish meal, but it's all about the proper process and making sure that it doesn't introduce harmful things into the garden. And we just don't have that ability to do that safely and for sure at home. So we always avoid those things. Dairy products, we all know dairy products can turn nasty really, really fast. That even includes eggshells. Eggshells can be put into a compost pile, but there's a process. If Carrie were here today, she could tell me that people microwave them to help kill the bacteria. They introduce high heat to kill that before they put that back in there. So they're adding calcium and good nutrients back in there. But if you add it in there as is, you know, you could be adding salmonella or other harmful bacteria in there that we don't want. Oils and greasy foods. Oils are going to smother microbes, and we definitely don't want that because they're the reason why we're going to have compost, and they're not going to break down. They're going to inhibit our compost pile. Pet waste is never an okay thing. Diseased plants, we already kind of mentioned that. If you're unsure, if you're looking at a plant that you pulled out of the garden, you know, if it's got like holes or something eaten in it from a worm or like, you know, just chewing damage, that's one thing. But if it's discolored, if it's got spotty leaves, if you've had to use a pesticide or something on it, you know, depending on your methodologies, we're going to avoid putting those in there at all cost. Because we don't want competition from bad microbes, or we don't want any pesticide remnants going in there, because we need these microbes that are going to break down these resources and create the compost to do their job as quickly as possible. You know, you mentioned earlier weeds in the lawn. That is a tricky one because there's always going to be weeds in a lawn. If we're bagging up our clippings, you know, we might get some in there, but ideally I would want to identify, because I don't need the entire yard worth of grass clippings unless I have a massive composting process, that I might only choose like really lush and healthy parts of the lawn to use as my greens to put in there. And if I have areas that are more weed ridden, which commonly weeds for most people, not all, some people have weeds everywhere. Most people have certain sections of the yard that are weed ridden for very specific reasons. And those I would avoid bagging and using, because those seeds, although we are going through a heating and processing to create the compost, they still can survive. And then you get weeds in your compost, then you introduce them into the garden, and then ideally they can grow, and you can repeat the process.
Excuse me, what about, you know, if you are going to use grass clippings, should you avoid using like weed and feed?
Yes.
Stuff like that?
Definitely no herbicides at all. You know, if you are using any kind of like lawn herbicide, you'd be better off just cutting and leaving the clippings and letting them lay, because that ingredient is already introduced into the soil and in that area. So you're not doing any more harm than what you had, but you're still getting the benefit of the nitrogen from those clippings. going back into the soil. But if you were putting something, I would avoid putting them in a compost pile. Chemically treated wood, so anything, if you got scraps or anything like that that have been broken down, people that utilize that are woodworkers, you could compost wood chippings and things like that. But a lot of times if you're doing that with treated lumber, you have different things in there that are trying to prevent rot. So that's bacteria and fungi that are going to break down wood. We don't want to introduce those into that space as well. So starting a compost pile, there's many ways that you can do this. Number one, we can create a bin. We can use a purchased or homemade bin with ventilation. We've got to make sure that oxygen is available. That's kind of like, I always remember back to like the green bins that I had when we were as a kid. They were just wire baskets, and that allowed airflow on all sides, oxygen introduced, which is absolutely vital for composting. We could just make it into a pile. That's kind of what I have at home. I got a corner of my yard that doesn't grow grass in the back that nobody really goes to, and we just kind of have a pile, and that's where we throw things out that are worthwhile, and it still does the job. So basic steps for starting a new pile are starting with a layer of carbons or browns, and then adding a layer of greens. We're basically alternating layers because we don't want just all the browns and all, we want it mixed together because we need nitrogen throughout and we need carbon throughout. We can, after we get it going, and actually as we create these layers, ideally we want to start adding moisture. We want to start sprinkling in water. Compost has got to stay damp because if it's not damp, then your microbe activity is not going to exist. Moisture is kind of the tricky part. You've got to figure out the right ratio. Obviously, at some points, it's going to get really wet when we get heavy rains, like the other day, and we got like 10 inches of rain in a couple hours. But if we're supplementing water into our pile during the hotter times of year, we want it to be the equivalent of like a wrung out sponge. So you want to be able to fill the moisture, but I don't want to be able to squeeze it and it just pour water out. That's too wet. So if it becomes too wet, then our pile becomes anaerobic. So that means that the microbes can no longer breathe. They're kind of like drowning. So we got to have like kind of the perfect ratio for the majority of the time. So every 1 to 2 weeks, we're going to want to take and we're going to want to turn that pile, whether it be with a shovel, a fork, whatever we might have that makes sense for you at home. We don't need a special tool in my book, but we need to turn it over and flip those layers because that's introducing oxygen. If we don't introduce oxygen to the bottom of the pile, then the bottom of the pile is going to take a lot longer to break down than, say, the top of the pile. So it is important to break it down. And depending on how big your pile is, that can be more difficult. And that's kind of, I'll talk about an alternative method coming up here. So we could build a compost pile out of just wire, like welded wire. You could do it out of cattle panel. You could easily tie wrap up some panels together just to hold it in place. You could do it out of all kinds of different things. Option 2, a lot of people make compost bins out of pallet wood. Now I will say pallet wood, 9 times out of 10, probably going to be treated. But at the end of the day, you pick your battles as to what makes sense for you. I'm not saying that, that one little bit is going to stop your pile from being able to create compost, but it's a very, very common method that people use. And it's kind of interesting because you put those pallets in the compost, eventually they're going to rot and break down because of the composting activity that's happening. So they're actually getting recycled back in an interesting way. Typically, for most instances, I would like to build something that has 3 sides. You could do 4 sides, but 3 sides would be easier. Something to keep it in place and in one spot, but it's also accessible. That way I can easily turn it. If I make it difficult, that's one thing I always hated about the old bins we had. They were difficult. You couldn't really turn them really well because they were about waist high, and it's just not easy. So being able to have an open front will make management practices a lot easier. You can place it directly on the soil. You don't want a bottom on there because there are other things that can come up, like earthworms, native microbes that might already be in the soil. They're going to come up and get in that compost pile and start doing some of the work for us. You know, no matter what option you choose, they're both low cost. If you were going to build a bin, you could also buy bins. Buying bins gets really expensive from, you know, you get online and find things. There's not a lot of like inexpensive options. And then I feel you can create something on your own that's much higher quality and longer lasting than the money you spend on things that you can find online. So we're not doing this for aesthetics. We're doing it for functionality. A really common practice is creating a 3-bin system. And this really depends upon your level of composting. You know, if you only have a little bit of waste going into it and you're only creating a small amount of compost, this might not be practical. But if you're growing a lot of things, not just vegetables, if you're growing, you know, we have tons of stuff. We've got fruits, vegetables, tons of flowers, tons of potted plants, whatever it be. I could probably stand to have more than one compost pile. And also for my practices, because it takes me a long while to create this compost, I'd rather have things in different stages. So the 3-bin system allows me to, number one, have bin 1, which is my active pile. So this is all the things that are new. So we've got new kitchen scraps, new grass clippings, new leaves, new manure if we have backyard chickens, new plant debris. So we're continuing to fill this bin up with newer additives until it's full. And then we have actual bin 2, which is our active composting bin. This is where we're actually doing the decomposition. So we're turning this particular bin every 1 to 2 weeks. We're checking the moisture, adding water where needed. If so, we're watching the temperature. You can get compost thermometers. Usually your compost is going to get, I think, between 130 to 160 degrees. You know, I don't monitor the temperature. A lot of times in the summer, you can turn it over and see that it's hot. It gets a little steamy. And you could feel the heat. Honestly, if you put your hands in that compost, you can tell if it's hot. But bin 2 is where we're actually doing the work. So it's not quite ready, but it's not brand new. And then as bin 2 finishes, I can move it into bin 3, which is my actual usable compost that I can work from, that I can grab and I can add it to potted plants. I can add it to my raised beds, my rows, whatever makes sense. And then as I'm going through those stages, I'm moving down in basically a succession plan of compost. So it's an easy way to make sure that your compost is always ready and that what you are using, you know for a fact is done. Whereas right now, I kind of have at home, I just have the one pile, so I got to be careful. If I throw too much stuff in there at one time and then I go over there, I could be getting compost that's hot that maybe once was not fully hot because portions of it are ready and portions of it are not. But a 3-bin system might not make sense for everybody with the space they have. It doesn't have to be a massive bin, you know, so it can be built to really any size. So common problems that come up with composting that you'll face are, number one, you get out there and you know the compost smells like funky. It doesn't smell good. You know, when you think about when you've grabbed compost before and you've smelt it, or you know, it has that rich, dark, earthy tone to it. You can start to get like foul or smelly odors from it, and that can happen because it has too much nitrogen. It's got too many greens, or honestly, it has too much moisture. Too much moisture around here to me would be probably the most common issue, because sometimes we go through really, really wet times and there's really not a lot we can do about that. You can combat this by adding more browns and turning the pile. Turning the pile is going to kind of, you're aerating it, you're allowing excess moisture to get out and move its way through the pile farther down. Air is going to help dry things up a little bit better. So simply adding more carbons or turning the pile, adding more oxygen and air. If your pile is not heating up, you get in there and it's just not breaking down. It's going really, really slow. You don't really see anything happening after a while. It could be too dry. If it's too dry, the microbes aren't going to do the work for you, or you might not have enough nitrogen, so your ratio is off. A lot of times it's ratio or moisture are your common problems. You can add water if it's too dry, obviously, or you can add more nitrogen-rich material. If you're getting a lot of like flies, like fruit flies, pests in your garden, you do even like varmints, that's coming from exposed food scraps or maybe too much food scraps at one time. Anytime you're going to put fresh kitchen waste in there, you need to make sure you bury it in the pile. It doesn't need to be at the bottom, but it's got to be down a little bit. That's going to help mask that smell and stop a lot of varmints and just nuisance things like flies or fruit flies from really becoming abundant in there.
Is there a ratio you need to pay attention to when you add carbon with that food scrap?
So since your food scraps are or your greens, if you're constantly adding, I would be adding a little more carbon. So you're trying to keep that 1 to 2 or maybe 1 to 3 ratio. So I would definitely, if you're constantly adding food scraps in there, I would definitely be constantly adding at least equal or more amounts of browns in there. If the compost is too wet, again, it's poor drainage or excess greens. Very similar. You just got to turn the pile. And that's a really big common mistake. People put a compost pile and they don't turn it. And you go through wet spells here in our climate, then it's going to get nasty before it gets good. So have a plan. Make it easy to actually turn it over, and you can eliminate a lot of the common issues, because I think that's really too wet pests are the most common issues that I see people come across whenever they're dealing with piles. So when is it ready? It's kind of a subjective thing. There's no magical, light that's going to go off and tell us that it's ready, but we've got to be able to identify. When we know what we started with, we know what compost, good quality compost, if we've ever bought some, looks like. It should be dark, like very, very dark brown or a blackish color. It should smell good. It should have a really, really earthy, it shouldn't smell good. People don't like the way compost smells a lot of times, but it should have that natural earthy smell to it, and it should be crumbly and soil-like. If you still have a lot of large chunky particles in it, then it's not particularly ready. And we see this commonly when people buy soil mixes that are going through the composting phase. If it has too much large organic matter in there, then the nitrogen is going to be robbed away from the plant material in which we are wanting to grow, because that soil or those organic particles are still breaking down. Ideally, it's going to be no longer recognizable as what went in. It should look completely different. It should look like a very, very fine soil-like texture. You should be able to sift through it really easily. And that's how you're going to improve your soil structure. If it's big and chunky, yeah, you're going to add air in there, but you're going to rob the nutrients away because it's not quite ready. So depending on conditions, compost can be ready anywhere as early as 3 months to 12 months. And it all depends on what is going into it. In the earlier months, the compost will be hot. You might see visible steam. And around the 6-month mark, you're going to begin to cool down if you haven't been adding constant new things to it. And you'll be able to feel the temperature difference as you're working through that and turning it over.
Would you buy a thermostat or something to check the temperature?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I mean, for me, the more resources I have and the more tools I have, I feel are going to make me more successful. So a compost thermometer, I think, is great, because it's going to tell me a lot. If it's obviously, if it's too hot, I can turn it. I can introduce more oxygen into it if it's out of the temperature range. But because if it's too hot, the microbes aren't going to be able to survive in it. but if it's not hot enough, then it's not actually breaking down. So knowing the temperature of the pile can tell me a lot about what needs to happen. So if it's too hot, add more browns in. If it's too cool, add more greens in. So absolutely.
David, before you go into that section there, you know, the stages between 1 and 2, how do you know when to transfer 1 to 2 and 2 to 3?
I mean, essentially what's happened, you're kind of doing it all at once in a sense. I would say, you know, that system in my mind, I think like new stuff goes here. When my pile's ready, ideally I've moved through my existing pile, so I'm just shifting things over, and I'm restarting the process. You know, there you can fold things in, but if I were going to be folding in and just kind of topping off each stage, I would ideally be turning the new stuff from pile 1 probably more towards the bottom of pile 2, so that I have access to the finished pile 2 moving in here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, because if you're just constantly adding new stuff in the middle, then again you're back into the same boat. It's never truly completely finished.
Right.
And you could also, there are ways, you know, it depends on how much you want to get. You could sift out the fine particles, you know, leaving behind the bigger stuff in pile 2, and then you're pulling out of that, you know, the fine stuff. I could be sifting it into my wheelbarrow, utilizing that finished stuff, but still putting the larger particles back in to my active pile. You know, but it depends on how much work you want to put into it. So obviously compost, you know, most of us know what to do with compost. Compost is slow release nutrients. It's slow release resources. So the most effective use of it is top dressing. So we can add it to the tops of containers. We can add it as top layers to our raised beds. We can even, if we're lawn gurus, compost top dressing our yard provides crazy results. So we can take this and we can use it simply by just putting it on top. We can blend it in. Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with working compost into the soil. We can work it into potting mixes. We can blend it into new beds as a whole. You know, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it, but there are some more effective methodologies for using it. I like to top dress my raised beds or garden rows because I know oftentimes I need to add soil, because as my soil breaks down, the volume gets low and I don't have enough soil for my root zone. So I'm adding that in here, putting it on the top, and as it gets moisture, the nutrients work its way through the root system, and I'm getting those compost benefits throughout the soil. So as I mentioned earlier, we can, you know, as a tip, we can chop materials into smaller pieces for faster production and breakdown. We want to make sure that we keep the compost moist but not soggy. It's always a good idea to stick your hands in there and see what kind of moisture you have. If you can wring it out and it's soaking wet, we've got to do something to eliminate some of that excess moisture. Turn it regularly for faster results. Everything needs oxygen. It's just like the root zone of your plants. You need oxygen in there. We often overlook that. The compost pile's got to have air and oxygen moving through it for the microbes to be able to do their work quicker and more efficiently. Add a variety of materials. So add a variety of greens and browns. Don't pick all one source. You know, different nutrients are available in different types of plant material. And when you're composting back those in there, you're getting a more robust, well-rounded compost by choosing different sources. It's the same concept if you're buying compost, where you can buy multiple types to achieve a wider nutrient set than just using one thing.
What are your thoughts on putting alfalfa pellets in
Alfalfa pellets, I mean, they're essentially a green, so it's
to heat it up? And
yeah, it's a nitrogen source. It's a slow release nitrogen source. So
break it on down.
yeah. Lastly, you got to be patient. Compost isn't going to happen overnight. As we all know, good soil and good gardening practices also don't happen overnight. You got to let nature do the work. And that's kind of most of my spill. On the very last pages on here, which I didn't really dive into in the slideshow, but your compost pile is essentially part of a living ecosystem. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I put this in here so you can read it. When you start a compost pile, the first thing that shows up is bacteria. Bacteria actually breaks down nitrogen. So grass clippings and greens that are in there, they're going to start making that nitrogen available to the pile. They're also going to break down simple sugars and proteins, and they're going to generate a lot of the heat as they feed, and bacteria multiplies rapidly. I was reading a book, Teaming with Microbes, recently. It's complex, so it hurts my brain to listen to sometimes. But they said if bacteria was unregulated, it could double the size of Earth in a matter of like a very small amount of time, like unfathomable amount, because it creates, it eats and it creates. And so they're doubling, and it's just a really interesting fact. So they're really, really important. You have fungi, which fungi are going to jump in and they're going to start breaking down the tougher carbon materials. So if you've ever cut down a tree at your house and you get mushrooms or chunky hard growth where the roots used to be, that's that fungi. They're breaking down that harder, tougher fibrous material that they were once attached to or they were a part of, and they're making those carbons available. So your bacteria are helping break down the nitrogen. Fungi are breaking down a lot of the carbons. So they're working together. The fungi create enzymes, which they break apart cellulose, which is kind of the compounds that make plants rigid. You know, that's what termites actually eat. They eat cellulose. They don't eat wood. So what's really important, as I mentioned about like the bacteria, that how they can multiply rapidly. That's where you have things like protozoas and nematodes. Nematodes, we think of those often as gardeners as a negative thing, but there's so many more beneficial species. They're kind of like the prey. They're out there feeding on the bacterias and the fungi, and they're helping keep them regulated, but they're also cycling nutrients back into the soil. So it's just like us, you know, if we were left unkept and we lived forever, there'd be no animals left on Earth, you know, because we'd probably hunt and eat them all faster than we could produce them or raise them. Same thing happens in the soil. Although we can't see it, there's predators and there's prey. You also have arthropods and earthworms. So it's one of the reasons why your compost piles need to have open bottoms. Worms, although they're not microbes, they play a huge part. They aerate that soil for you. They eat in that soil, and then they actually produce nutrient-dense droppings, worm castings that, you know, are an amazing fertilizer or almost essentially a compost for you.
Should I add worms to my compost?
I don't think it will hurt. Composting worms are awesome. They can actually break down things so much faster. I mean, I did a class last year on vermicomposting, which is essentially worm composting. They'll break down your food scraps a lot faster, but you still have to have that ratio of like browns to greens. You're still supplying some of that, but it is a little different. So I would say, without going back and reading my notes and things, because I don't remember, your ratios might be slightly different with that. But they'll tear through some food scraps, but they don't eat it all. They will not eat everything that you put in there. My worms didn't like dill. They did not like carrots unless they were broken down really, really small and chopped up. So certain things they didn't really respond to, and I had to take them out. And you kind of have to watch with worms because it was very easy to get a higher fruit fly population because I was utilizing more food scraps than I were in the traditional pile. And also, even in that worm pile, you got to bury it to help regulate some of that pest issue.
But if you do if you just let the ground be your bottom, won't the earthworms come on?
You will, but like your native earthworms and stuff are definitely not going to be, you know, they're gonna break things down and they're gonna create like vermicompost, but they're not as efficient composters, say, as like red wigglers or some of the other composting species out there. So, you know, it just kind of depends. If you want to, worms are not that expensive, but you got to keep them fed. It's kind of like taking care of a dog in a sense. Like when I had my worm bins out back before, if we didn't constantly have something in there, I couldn't find the worms in the bin. They moved on because they're not going to stay somewhere where there's not an abundant food source. So,
I wouldn't either.
yeah,
When I was a kid, my grandpa had a big compost bed, and you'd be digging in there, and I mean, earthworms almost the size of my finger right here, you know, big and long. What is that? Is that a?
Night crawlers.
it's probably just a different species than, you know, there's so many different species of worms like that. I mean, and some of them are not good, just like anything else. But yeah, I mean, the more nutrient dense the compost pile and the soil is, the more attractant you're going to have to different species of worms, and they're going to get larger and healthier because the resources are located in one place, and it's abundant, it's consistent, you know, and that's, and you know, and two, like when you're dealing with like worms in a pile, the pile's more aerated. You think about like worms, what's the first thing that happens when we get a downpour of rain in the yard? All the worms and all the snails come to the top, because in that clay soil, while they're working to break it up and create those airways, it's much more difficult to do the work, and then it becomes anaerobic because the water has filled all the pores really, really fast because of the clay soil, and they can no longer breathe, so they come to the surface. So when you get them in a pile that has a more porous environment and water moves through more efficiently, they're going to thrive and be bigger and healthier and be more abundant. I think that's pretty much where I'm going to wrap up today, other than if we have questions that I can hopefully answer.
One more question. Sawdust. So I know not to use treated wood, but what about just plywood? It's got glues and stuff in it.
I mean, I'm of the opinion most of the time, like, I'm going to pick my battles. Like, you know, I think about it in a way like, what's going to happen to it if I just throw it out, you know? You'd be surprised, microbes can eat away toxins. It's like, I don't have it up here today, but pesticide residuals and stuff that are in soil, contaminants, high salt content, they can actually be eliminated from a healthy microbial environment. So things like glues, I would find far less maybe dangerous than other things, but I'm not going to be able to eliminate everything out there. It's just not unreasonable, because like at the end of the day, it's like, go to the grocery store. What's half the stuff in the food we eat? You know, what actually is it? You don't know. So I would, if it wasn't treated, because most of your treated lumber now is treated with copper. Copper is a natural fungicide, so it keeps it from molding, deteriorating. I would probably be okay with it, but that's just me. It's kind of like growing an organic garden here in Southeast Texas. Like, can I actually really do that? No.
But any kind of wood would be okay, like pine, say, cedar.
Yeah, you're like the tougher, the harder the wood is, the longer it's going to take to break down. You think like cedar has natural rot and rot resistance to it. Yeah. It's not going to break down as fast. Now, if you chewed it up and it was like in a sawdust texture, sure, it's going to break down quicker, but even cedar is not going to break down as quick as pine. Okay. So yeah, you could, but I would make sure that it's in like a small, fine form.
The stuff now is, the treated lumber and stuff now is treated with,
it's treated with copper. I think they used to use like arsenic treatments. Yeah. They don't do that anymore. I don't even think that's allowed.
There's actually a place in Westlake that you can buy the old-fashioned treated stuff.
Really?
But that's one that you would not want to use.
No.
In a compost or even in a bed.
You don't even want to build a deck with it. They had kids dying from it, walking on it barefoot.
Right.
I want to go back to that temperature range of your compost bed. What's the low range and what's the high range?
130, 160.
That's it?
No, it's not super hot. So, because if you think that doesn't seem very hot in the grand scheme of things, but you start getting hotter than that, it's going to be really, really hard to, for microbes to survive. So think about it in a sense like this. If it gets too hot, you're going to start depleting your population.
You're blowing your stuff up. I mean, they'll die, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, if it get, you think about like boiling temperature, if it got like up into the upper 100s, maybe not boiling, a lot of those species are probably not going to be able to survive in that hot of a temperature.
But 160 is where you cook your meat to make sure
Yeah.
there's nothing in it.
Yep. So that's kind of, 160. I think 160 is the high range. And one thing that I didn't talk about, like, when you're dealing with temperature, you're going to see a drastic reduction in like how compost breaks down based upon the time of year. Like right now, compost will create real fast because it's heating up. I also keep mine in kind of a shady spot because at the same time, I don't want it to get too hot. If it's incredibly too hot, then it's going to slow down as well because the amount of microbes in there are going to be the equivalent of if it's too cool, the activity is slow. They kind of go dormant. So the wintertime takes a lot longer. It's still working, but there's a lot less visible results. Whereas the summer and the springtime when we're heating up, you're seeing a lot more activity happening.
So in order to kill the unwanted seeds, what would you need? 130?
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know on that. That's not one thing. I've never dealt with like having seeds come up, I've had like different vegetables and stuff obviously come up in the compost pile, but I don't know what the temperature would be required to kill like noxious seeds.
Yeah.
That's one thing I don't have a truthful answer to.
I used hay for mulch one year. That was a mistake. When I first started gardening,
Yeah, it is.
I had hay. So, but they said if you composted it, they would sprout and die.
Yeah.
Oh, what
yeah.
if I already have a lot of eggs in my compost? Would you risk it? Or throw it all out?
I'm sure it'll be all right.
Okay.
I mean, it's one of those things. Like, how are you gonna really know?
If I die, I guess.
I don't think you're gonna die.
So if you really get into it, like, is pH real important, or just these smells and stuff? Adequate.
pH is more. I don't think pH really is super important for composting. Again, that's like a little deeper than what I've ever gotten into it personally. So I'm not saying that it couldn't have any effect, but pH is where you're going to get into. That's what makes nutrients available or unavailable. pH of water.
Alkaline.
Yeah, alkaline and acidity. So I mean, if the pH was not somewhat regulated in your compost, then I would ideally say that your compost could be not beneficial. And I doubt that certain microbes are going to be able to survive in certain spectrums of the pH scale. So I don't know. That's something that I'm going to have to go home and do some more homework on. So it's going to be
How
my.
would your pH get off? Because you're using regular. I mean, unless you're putting some type of acid or alkaline in there.
You could be putting in there if you're let's say like, so a common thing sometimes people they'll take like old soils, like let's say like the other day we emptied out some pots and I've got some old bricks and roots and like where it's just kind of like the roots filled the pot up, it's kind of root bound. I'm gonna take that up and I'm gonna go chop it up and put it back out into my compost pile, and I'm gonna let those roots break down, and I'm gonna use that soil to kind of aerate some of the areas. Well, if I'd been feeding a very high phosphorus fertilizer, if I'm constantly pumping in a bloom booster, that's gonna change over time the pH, because phosphorus oftentimes can contribute to acidity in the soil. So some of the things that we're using, and depending on what we're putting into the pile, you could have some things that are changing that pH. But
But it's kinda like I said, it's something you have to put in there. It's not gonna be from grass and leaves and.
No, not necessarily.
Well, the real reason I brought it up is because I know that I didn't know about compost, but like your soil that you're planting in needs to be within a certain pH, right?
Yeah, you want it slightly acidic to neutral for most like gardening items. You know, there are things that like acidic soil. You know, like a lot of your fruits, your berries and such will like that acidic soil. You know, tomatoes can handle a little bit of acidity, but ideally most things are going to fall in that like 6.5 to like 7 range. You know, you could maybe get a little lower than 6.5, but not much. And that's the optimal zone that those plants need to be able to absorb nutrients from the soil if they're there. And if your pH isn't right, it's kind of like, here's the root, and here's some calcium, iron, and I'm trying to absorb a brick. And so your nutrients are locked up. If the pH for a plant is not the right, it can't actually absorb the nutrients. And this is something that happens all the time. Like take tomato growing, for instance. You get calcium deficiencies from, if your pH isn't right, your tomato might not be able to absorb the calcium that's probably there in abundance already. Or if the soil is too wet or too dry, it changes the availability of nutrients. So it does play a huge factor into what you get out of compost and fertilizer going into the garden.
One other question. Watching a podcast that they were adding sugar water to the compost.
Okay, that would make. I mean, I could see that. So sugar water, you're increasing your what they call your Brix value, which is your level of sugar, and microbes feed on sugars. So bacteria and fungi, whenever they're actually working with a plant, they're trading the plant for what you call exudates, which is essentially like sugars. And then the plant, the microbes are providing nutrients to the plant. So sugar water is essentially, it's kind of the same as like horticultural molasses. You could add molasses to a pile. It's very, very high in sugar. And when you have a higher amount of sugars, then your microbes might multiply faster. They may have more resources, and your compost pile might break down quicker. That's at least what I would take from that.
If some of my scraps start getting mold on it, is that bad? Before I put it in there?
Not necessarily. I mean, if it's like slimy, nasty, like wet mold, sure. But if you're burying them in the pile, then that shouldn't happen. And any kind of like molds or like.
In that container before I put it, I fill it up, and then in the bottom, yeah, it'll get sludgy.
If it's getting sludgy, I would avoid putting it out. Put it out sooner, you know. Because that's if it's sludgy and. Sludgy is going to make your fruit fly population just get real damp and nasty. Then you're going to get like fruit flies really, really quick. It's just not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a nuisance. And then,
But it will break down.
Yep. Yep, it will. It will. Any other questions?
Good job as always.
I appreciate everybody as always. Happy to see some familiar faces. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, hope you guys have the rest of an awesome day.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Always.
David. We don't need.
Okay. I'll reuse it. So.